Cool, why don't we get started? Thanks, Michelle. Like Michelle said, I've known her for about 4 years now. I actually know her fiance. I've known him for almost 15 years. He was actually the first PT I've ever met. I was the probably biggest musculoskeletal biomechanical mess he had ever seen in his entire life when I came into him, and he basically just told me, Jason, don't run anymore. It's just not a good idea for you. But with that said, Jeff, he really instilled a passion into me. And that passion was to continue to pursue exercise science and physiology and its relation to endurance athletics, but more of that biomechanical injury preventative. You know, we want to take that with a grain of salt, but rehabilitation and how we transition from this atmosphere here. How do we transition from the PT office back into everyday running, whether that's training for a 5K, marathon, whatever it may be. And my background is exercise physiology and science, and this is not working. There we go. So with a background in exercise science, everything I do, whether it's lecturing, whether it's talking to someone about a specific health goal they want to do, I want to start with applied science, because we got to start with what we know, not necessarily what our friends said who we were out on a run with, or Runner's World magazine, men's health, women's health, whatever it may be. Let's start with fundamental physiology, fundamental biomechanics, nutrition, etc., and build off of that in the latest research, and then we can start going other directions. But let's start with what we know. And that's what we're going to do tonight, and talking about this injury rehabilitation in the lab or in the office here, and progressing it outside of that. But whenever we talk about the endurance athlete, we have to look at what determines our rate of progression. And that means how quickly can we come back from an injury, and then how quickly can we meet peak optimal performance. And the first thing you got to look at is genetics. And, you know, you're blessed with what mom and dad gave you, okay? I was blessed with terrible genetics. I have the vision of a 90-year-old man, you know, nystagmus. There's nothing I can do about that. I have terrible knees. I have terrible hips. I had a kidney transplant 6 years ago. Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. Great genetics, all right? I think the only good piece of genetics I was given, I often get carded. I often am portrayed as a 22-year-old kid, but I'll take it. You know, that's the one good piece of genetics I was given. With that said, you and I both have something despite what genetics we were given, and that's an inherent ability, something that we can tap into. It may mean one day you're running a 30-minute 5K, and then you one day can progress to a 25-minute 5K. Or it may mean you might qualify for the Olympic trials. But what that inherent ability means is you can get better, no matter what you do. And the way we do that from an endurance athletic standpoint, so we got to stress the body. We got to go out there and train. We got to recover from that. We got to look at our weight management. We got to look at nutrition, strength training, excuse me. And we also have to look at technique in some aspects, okay? These are the things that are going to dictate how well we do in this sport and how often we may be injured, okay? But first, one thing we have to touch base on tonight is running economy, okay? We want to know how well someone's doing in the sport of running by testing their running economy. And what that means simply is, if I had an identical twin and we go out for a run, okay? We weigh the same exact height, everything is exactly the same. And we go out and we're running at, say, 8 minutes per mile pace, okay? I'm out of shape, I have not trained, all right? That's an 80% exertion level for me. You know, RPE scale, we're talking, you know, 16, 17. This is a hard effort for me. But for my identical twin, this is a 7, 8, and 9. It's very easy for him to run this. He's taking a lot less oxygen to achieve this 8-minute per mile pace. He is more economical than me. The reason we discuss this in injury and any type of strength training, technique, any change that we make, because we want to measure to see if that change works. So I'm going to use running economy often tonight and see, you know, what different aspects of training stress affect running economy, both positively and negatively. And then we got to talk about injury. Runners are injured all the time, all right? They keep food on your table because most runners, whether they're new, whether they're inexperienced, or whether they're seasoned, will at one point in time come across injury. The number one thing we see that affects runners and has them become, you know, in the PT lab and getting injured is they're doing too much, their training load, okay? They implemented it too quickly. The next thing is their experience, all right? how long have they been in the sport, and it kind of goes hand in hand with previous injury as well. We often see these newer runners get injured more, okay? And a lot of them have injuries right off the get-go, and throughout their career, we see the same injuries over and over again. And the question we got to keep asking ourselves, is this something we can prevent if we know it's going to happen time and time again? Some other things that cannot be dismissed is structural and biomechanical imbalances, and I put that in quotations. And then, you know, excess weight. We definitely got to look at body weight and so on and so forth, okay? I start off with a story of myself, okay? I got a little cold going on, so I apologize, a little scratchy. So the story that I start off with is how I am the best PT patient ever, because you see me often, all right? In the sense of I'm always injured, okay? And when I first decided to take on running and triathlon, I was 19 years old. I was cocky. I was a decent athlete, but I was never really good. So I don't know why I was cocky, but I think it was because the first time I ever showed up to a triathlon, I'm like, oh my gosh, everyone's old here. They're 40, 50, 60 years old. Dad, I'm going to win this race. And my dad's like, son, you might want to calm down, all right? You know, I know you're young, but these guys have some experience. I said, no, Dad, I'm going to win, okay? So I'll never forget getting out of that water and being like, maybe top 70%, you know, I was getting destroyed at this point. My dad's like, you got a lot of ground to make up on the bike. You better go as hard as you can. So I went as absolutely hard as I could on that bike. It did not do much for me at all because I continued to get passed by that other 30%, all right? I was realizing quickly that I should have probably have trained for this event a little bit more than I, you know, went into it. But I'll never forget that sound when someone goes and passes you. Woo, woo, woo. They're coming up very quickly. And I heard that the entire bike leg. But I'll never forget this one lady that passed me because as I looked over, the first thing I saw was baby blue because she was riding a baby blue beach cruiser. She wasn't even on a triathlon or a road bike. She was on a beach cruiser with a pink helmet. I'm like, oh my God, please tell me she's not in this race. I'm going to crash my bike right now. But then she asked me how much longer she had in the race. And that's why I told her in the midst of trying to get some oxygen, you have about 4 miles left. Now, did nothing for my ego, but I did pass her during that run, okay? With that said, I did what every one of your patients have done and what I did at the time. I went home, I went online, I went to the library, I went to Barnes & Nobles, picked up Runner's World magazine, Triathlete magazine, I sought out all the fast athletes. How do I get better? What do I do differently? And I had a race 4 weeks later, and I implemented everything I learned in that 4 weeks. Well, what happened? I got hurt, I was overtrained, I was beat up, okay? And that's basically the population that you're going to see, the non-elite runner, the non-elite endurance athlete that doesn't make a living out of it. And ultimately, running itself is becoming extremely popular. We're seeing more and more people out there that are out there just having fun, taking on 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons, marathons. Now, when we go through these average or median times of these races, they're not very competitive. They're a little bit on the slower side, okay? And the reason they're on the slower side, which I'm totally fine with, is because people are just out there having fun. But when they're done having fun and they're realizing, I just did my first 5K, I just did my marathon, I want to get better, what do? They often look at elite runners, okay? Now this is Paula Radcliffe, all right? Paula Radcliffe's the fastest woman ever, fastest woman's distance runner ever on the planet. She runs the marathon in 2:15, okay? That makes me want to puke. That's incredible, all right? She surpasses pretty much anyone nowadays and anyone in the past. I mean, she is an incredible athlete. And when we look at what she's done over the past 12 years, what we see is all she's done is she's run a lot and she's done some explosive strength training. That's basically all she's done. She hasn't done anything fancy. Now, she's also blessed with ridiculously good genetics, okay? But the newer athlete, the newer runner sees this and says, well, I need to run more. And you do. But often when we run too much, we overload and we get hurt. And this is what we see all the time because we have this fast food mentality, all right? Any new runner, seasoned runner, they always want something different. They want a PR in the marathon. They want to finish their first 5K and take on a marathon next week, okay? You got to constantly instill into them that this is a long-term sport. That graph I showed you of Paula Radcliffe, over 11 years, you saw that she continually improved. And if they continued this study, specifically looking at her running economy and her VO2 max, you probably would have seen that go down even more and more. So she was taking less oxygen at 15 kilometers per hour, you know, when she was 19 versus when she was in her 30s. That's very impressive, okay? So let's get away from that, and let's get away from that fast food mentality. Let's get away from, a lot of times we also see on the other end of the spectrum, that training load from an intensity standpoint. I went out for an easy run. I didn't feel like I hammered myself into the ground. I didn't do anything. We're addicted to fatigue, okay? And we see this in every sport. I'm not curling over and throwing up, so I didn't do my job well. This is the mindset we have to change, but this is the athlete that I see, and this is the patient that you see, okay? And what I do with my athletes, I have athletes mostly in the Mid-Atlantic area, and so do my assistant coaches. But I also have athletes in Europe, I have athletes in California, Colorado, etc. The first thing I do, whether they are local or whether they are in the West Coast, I find a PT in that area that I want to work with so I can see them get a musculoskeletal, biomechanical, basically assessment so we can communicate from that end, because that's huge, all right? So I not only want communication with you, but really you need to communicate with their coach or whoever, is dictating what they're doing, and communicate with them. And then together, we work on a systematic progression. Listen, I only take on 15 athletes a year at this point because I have another company that I own, but this is more not generally me saying, hey, I want you to send people to me. It's, hey, communicate with their coaches. Communicate with them about what they're doing and be systematic about it, because everything we talk about is going to build on top of it, each other, each concept. And stick to the fundamentals. Everything I'm talking about today is really just basic biomech and physiology. There's nothing really too concrete or outside of new research, etc. The stuff you probably have heard before, okay? It's just about implementing it in a different way. In the first place let's start off with some smaller things that you can work on, and I often see that weight management. We see more and more injuries with these newer runners because they're a little heavier, okay? Their ground reaction forces are going to be higher. The stress in their knees and their hips, their lower backs, it's going to be harder. It's going to be higher, It's going to place more stress and set them up for further injury. They need to progress a little slower. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like as PTs, you're allowed to talk about this. You're allowed to say, hey, you might want to think about losing a couple pounds. You're not telling them to go on the Lindsay Lohan diet, all right? You're just saying, hey, this might help you out a little bit, okay? The first place you could do that is probably exercise. But when we look at the literature, exercise versus nutrition, in terms of weight loss, it's pretty, black and white. Nutrition is really the place you need to start and where you're going to see the most gains right off the bat, especially since most of these people are already doing a fair amount of working out, okay? Don't get me wrong, they could work out a lot more, but in order to see the exact same thing or get the same exact benefits of nutrition, you got to work out a lot. We're talking 70, 90 minutes a day, all right? But I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty, small, minute details of nutrition because we don't have to, all right? I was at a venue a year and a half ago, and I got done and I called the local PT. He was opening this up to the public, and it was mainly for the public. And he said, can you talk about nutrition and some basic concepts? I said, sure. I called him after. I said, well, what did you think? And he goes, I thought everything was great, but I thought the nutrition stuff was pretty basic. I said, oh, okay, well, tell me more. What do you think? He's like, I really thought you should have gone into a lot more detail. And I said, all right, well, why is that? Well, this demographic, might have, this was very sixth grade. And I said, that's fine, but no one follows the fundamentals. Why do we need to get super out of control? Let's look at all the new research studies, more fat because this does that. We don't need to do that. We need to stick with the fundamentals. Like when you go to ShopRite, if you decide to get strawberries over Pop-Tarts, you're winning, okay? You're doing a great job. You decide to get oatmeal over Captain Crunch, well, that's a terrible decision because Captain Crunch is such a phenomenal cereal. But you get what I'm saying here. Most people, you think they know basic nutrition, but they don't. They don't understand the essentials, okay? I love this quote, all right? Feed a man a fish and you feed him a meal. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Diets don't do this. Diets from a weight loss to performance, they create boundaries. That's the problem, okay? They don't necessarily create habits, all right? And you want to create habits. You want to talk about these fundamental principles. Every single one of you who is a PT at one point in time, you know what I'm talking about up here, all right? These are basic principles of nutrition. You could put this on a worksheet for your patients, and it will help them because we want them to instill this in small doses. You want them to have variety. You don't want them just to get the apples and the iceberg lettuce. You want them to get nuts and grab a kiwi, get some kale, okay? Mix it up. Balance. It's not all about carbohydrate. It's not all about fat. It's not all about protein, okay? It's about a balance. Everyone's going to be a little different, but for the most part, you don't have to have excess one macronutrient, okay? And moderation. Look, I'm from Northeast Philly. I grew up. I love cheesesteaks and hoagies, okay? You're never going to get me to stop eating them. But as long as I don't eat them every single day, not a bad thing. So you're not telling people they can't eat chocolate cake anymore. And that's the problem with most of the boundaries we place on people. And then you want to talk about these 6 principles here that are the hands down most research principles that we see, okay, in the literature from the 60s to today. Nothing has changed on the benefits of a diet full of fruit and vegetables, healthy fats, fibrous foods, okay, protein, but let's stay away a little bit from the beef and so on and so forth, the red meat, because we do see a little bit of negativity there. But I'm not saying that you completely have to get away from it. It's a little bit of a hot spot in the nutrition world. Let's minimize processed foods, the stuff at the end of the aisles, okay? And then lastly, let's limit or eliminate supplements. That's it. This is simple. I don't need to go into much more than this, okay? Because most people don't know more than this. If you feel they're doing all these principles, then they're doing something else wrong if they're hitting all this on the head. I was asked to touch a little bit on the female triad. I'm going to touch on it very, very quickly, but the main thing is that when their nutritional status, the female's nutritional status, is hindered, lack of calories, lack of nutrient density, okay? You're going to see their menstrual function and bone strength affected by that. But there's other things as well. How much training are they doing? So basically these females, they're out there, they're training a ton, okay? And they're not taking in the adequate nutrition, and what's affecting is their menstrual cycles and their bone health. I'm not going to go into great detail for this, except that the main thing that you need to communicate with your athletes and your patients is they need to eat more. Because that's the number one thing we see in the literature in terms of, having that athlete come back from the female triad. But this is a lot more of a complicated subject. And what I mean by that is that often they beat themselves up so much from hormonal imbalances and bone density that their bone density is not recovering as quickly as it should. There's 2 sports med docs that I would highly suggest you network with in the area that are phenomenal with this. One most of us know is Katie Galato. Her office is in Voorhees, right? Voorhees. And someone who I actually just had coffee with yesterday, who I seen speak about 2 weeks ago, is Dr. Ellen Casey. She's new, she's at Drexel. Probably one of the smartest human beings I've ever talked to. She's not only a sports med doc, but she has literally working on 3 other studies. She just put in 3 other grants. I mean, she has her hands dipped in everything. She just moved here from Chicago. These are the people you want to seek out when your athletes are having a lot of issues, or you feel like they're having issues with this. I have a couple studies on this specifically that looks at intake forms to see if someone has the female triad, and I would highly suggest you implement that if you think this is an issue. But ultimately, what you want to tell them to do is just eat a little bit more, especially after their workouts, when they have expended a lot of calories, okay? And really one from a protein synthesis and a glycogen synthesis, their cell receptors really want that food at that point. More their glycogen than their protein. That protein synthesis sits around for a while. So you don't have to necessarily throw down protein right away when you get done working out. But ultimately, frequent meals as well for these ladies. I've dealt with a lot of females with this. And 9 times out of 10, just fixing some nutritional stuff, everything starts to kind of even out on its own. But a lot of times it's more complicated than that. So I want to switch thought processes here, okay? We talked about just 2 basic things that I think could start to help your runners. But let's really get into the meat and potatoes at this point. And before we do that, I want to talk about, when you were 3 or 5 years old, how many, with a raise of hands, mom and dad came home and said, all right, Sally, Jim, get in the backyard. I'm going to teach you how to run today. How many parents taught them? No, right? Very rarely do we see that. I think mom and dad taught this guy how to, run. All right, when the hippopotamus comes, stay on your toes, get tall. No, run as fast as you can, okay? And this is the big topic nowadays, is running technique. Is it natural? Is it learned? Or is it a combination? Should we be fixing running technique here in the PT office? That is the question, okay? And ultimately, what you are going to find is a lot of the runners that look at technique that you are dealing with, they're going to say, I want to run like X elite runner, or I want to run like, that Olympian, okay? And when we look at actually the top runners in the world, we look at East African runners and European runners, and this one particular study looked at both of them and looked at all the biomechanical variables, okay? And they looked at all the physiological variables. What differentiated them to two? Well, obviously the East Africans, who have dominated the distance running world the past 30 years, were physiological and more economical. They had higher VO2 maxes, okay? But then the European runners. But when they looked at all the different variables from biomechanics, there was nothing that was the same, all right? There was all little different variables that each runner possessed. There was no concrete thing or template that they were all falling into, okay? So they were very different. Can anyone tell me who this runner is right here? It's Erin Donahue. She's from Haddonfield, New Jersey, former Olympian, okay? When you watch her run, you move because you think she's going to tackle you, okay? She is not built like a distance runner. If we all went to happy hour after this, and Erin was there in two of her competitors, okay? And I said, who do you think's the fastest in the mile and the half mile? You would automatically put Erin to the side because she's bigger, all right? She's a little bit just built, looks like a football player almost on her upper body. And in high school, that actually helped her because not only did she win the mile and the 2 mile, she also won the javelin throw in state championships. That is, look at javelin throwers. They usually don't go turn around and go run the mile and 2 mile and win. It just doesn't happen. Takeaway message here is elite runners, everyone's different. And you can't look at someone and say that's a better way to run. That's a more efficient way to run or economical way to run. Now, I love this quote. Economy, in the truest sense, O2 kinetics, is not dependent at the sharp end of the sport on mechanical efficiency. Worry about the motor, not the spark plugs, okay? I do agree with that. The more elite the athlete is, the less we actually want to mess with their biomechanics, the way they run, etc. But I think we can't necessarily say this quote is true for every single athlete. I think the newer athlete, the runner that's been in there for a little bit of time, we might be able to mess with their mechanical efficiency, and it may help. But we have to take it with a huge grain of salt because it's very gray in the literature right now. Foot strike is not gray in the literature. But what is portrayed is that if you strike on your heel, you're the devil, okay? You're going to get hurt. You're ultimately set up for disaster. And unfortunately, that's not true because we've seen studies time and time again to show that rear foot striking is not only very, very popular, 75% of elite runners run on their heel, but all from a general 2:45 marathon is one study to 4.5, 5 hours, 92% of those runners were rear foot runners, rear foot strikers, okay? Heel strikers, all right? It's not a bad thing, okay? Ultimately, it can be a bad thing when you're striking on your heel, when you're overstriding, which we are going to talk about, and that's often what heel strike is associated with, is overstriding, okay? And that's when we take people into the lab and we say, hey, let's maybe switch your foot strike. Let's maybe increase your cadence. Let's look at your gait and see what we can change, okay? It's getting a lot of hype nowadays, okay? And this article drove me absolutely nuts. Did anyone read this in the Wall Street Journal? Okay? The reason it drove me nuts is this part here. The serious is runner salvation, okay? Because when you look at every single gait analysis study out there, they are not running more than 14 kilometers. That's the longest they are running on an average, 14 kilometers before they have gait analysis. And that's cut in half to what they're doing when they're actually changing their gait in a lab, okay? We need to see more studies. All right? But in the meantime, when we look in the lab, we are seeing some success, okay? Especially when there's a lot of verbal, visual, and auditory cues, okay? But again, it's very low mileage, all right? We're seeing step width, just simple dictations of, hey, don't let your knee rotate in as much, okay? Increase your cadence, etc. We are seeing some success. But some of that success is also coming from these protocols are 2 to 3, 4 weeks long, all right? And they're in that lab, in that gait lab, 5 times a week. The frequency is extremely high, so they're adapting very quickly. Are they going to be able to do that outside the lab? No, all right? There's only been one study so far that they've been able to maintain what they learned in the lab, and that was cadence, okay? This is something we are seeing a lot of good things on, and that's simply most non-elite runners, okay, newer runners, they tend to take about 150 to 165 steps per minute. It's usually towards that 150 range, and that usually sets them up for overstriding. And what that means is they're extending their leg all the way out, and landing like that, creating a lot more ground reaction force, a lot more vertical oscillation. By simply increasing that by 5 to 10%, taking more steps, we're decreasing all that load that's going into the hip and the knee, okay? Now, if we increase it even more than that, again, that load's going to go somewhere. You have to remember that when we increase it. So this study was basically looked at and, again, just showed that there's no mechanical advantage versus rear foot or forefoot striking. But one of the key things they say is, hey, every time you change something, that load's going somewhere different. So you might have someone with a lot of knee issues and you decide to increase their cadence. It has to be done super slowly because that load is now going to be in their gastroc, their soleus, their Achilles, etc. And we're seeing in a lot of these GAIT studies, subjects drop out because all of a sudden they're having calf problems or gastroc problems, Achilles, plantar fascia, etc. This stuff works, okay? I've seen a lot of people change their cadence and actually carry over outside, but we have to be aware of what happens when we change. Did anyone ever read this book, Born to Run, Chris McDougall? It's an okay book. It's not bad. We got to remember McDougall is an author. I've met him. I'm surprised he didn't pound me into the ground because he's about 6'4", 220 pounds, okay? And I met him when I was shadowing Dr. Irene Davis and Dr. Richard Wiley up at University of Delaware. And I constantly, busted his chops. I'm like, why do you think this works so well for you? Why? Why is barefoot the best? And he's like, telling me it's because the shoes are terrible and the heels are too thick and they're making him overstride, okay? No, he's overstriding because he's huge, okay? He's never really run before. This is just naturally what works well for him, okay? And he also was, I would talk about him training for marathons and stuff. Listen, the guys that are injured the most are guys like him. But here's why barefoot running worked for him, okay? As soon as he took off his shoes and started to land all the way out here in his bare foot, his body was like, that hurts a lot, all right? And ultimately, his stride shortened. His stride frequency increased. And all that load that was placed on his bad knees and hips was now more on his gastroc and soleus. And he actually did have some tightness and some issues with that, but he got over it and he was running a ton of miles injury-free. So again, here's another thing, stride frequency. This is something that we are seeing often work. Should you throw them in barefoot feet? No, absolutely not. I don't think that's ideal, but in some cases it may be. It may be a way to get a person to really feel that cadence and feel what happens when you land on your heel. Don't be fooled. 50% of the people that actually try to take off their shoes and run in bare feet, they don't automatically go to a midfoot or forefoot strike, or their stride frequency automatically does not increase, okay? They actually go right to the heel, and that's going to cause some issues. So we talked about some basic injury prevention stuff. Rehabilitation. Should we do, some GAIT analysis? What about, will it help from a running economy standpoint? I'm not going to go through every one of these studies, except this one. This was done by Moore and Jones out of University of Exeter in 2012. What they did here is they took a group of new women runners, 12-week course, and they measured them both physiologically and biomechanically before and after. And this is what's fascinating. They didn't change anything. All they did is implement a progressive training program. And what they found are these three results is what changed the most, okay, in terms of the kinematic variables. And when you look at these results, this is basically they're running a little bit faster. They're getting off the ground a little bit quicker, okay? This is just them being more fit, okay? You can't train any of these kinematic variables. You could. I think it would be ridiculous, okay? I don't think it's necessary. But ultimately, you saw their body naturally adapt, and this is what they did. A lot of them their cadences were a lot higher and so on and so forth. So, but in terms of changing running economy for the better, in terms of like we're talking about this study here and this study here, you change anything mechanically, most likely it is going to bring your running economy down. It's going to decrease it, okay? Does that mean we should not do it and throw it away? Absolutely not, okay? One study did have a decent effect where some people got a little bit better. And why the study worked is because it was longer. It was close to 16 weeks long. We haven't seen any long-term studies with running technique change and running economy yet, okay? Should we do it? Maybe, but I think it's going to take 6 months to a year, okay? This study was another study that looked at untrained versus very trained runners, and what they found, there was no one significant piece of biomechanical variance or kinematic variables that was different, okay? What they found were the elite runners who were running a lot more, they had a little less vertical oscillation, a little less side-to-side movements. their cadence was a little quicker, okay? And when it all came down and was said in the conclusion, they said, hey, this is because these runners have run hundreds of thousands miles more than these newer runners, okay? This is what they naturally adapted to. And there were some unique people. So like in the group that, you know, were the newer runners, some of them had no vertical oscillation whatsoever, where in some of the elite runners, they had a ton of up and down movement. Should we change it? Remains to be seen. I leave you with this with technique before we get into some strength training and training load aspects. Ultramarathon runners, when they look at them, it's really interesting to measure these principles, to measure increased or their stride frequency, vertical oscillation, and running economy. The longer the race is, what they find is towards the end of the race, we see an increase in stride frequency, okay? And think about it. I mean, first of all, these guys are idiots. They're going out there and running 100 miles. Who in their right mind would want to do that, okay? I love running. I don't want to run 100 miles. But the longer your body's out there, the longer your body's saying, hey, I need to change something because the same load is occurring on these tissues constantly, okay? And different joints and so on and so forth. So what happens is they shorten up their stride, okay? All that load that was being placed on their hips and knees is now going to their calves and soleus and so on and so forth, all right? So their vertical oscillation automatically starts to decrease, okay? But the running economy is decreased as well. Listen, you're going to lose some fitness when you go out and run 100 miles. You're not gaining anything from that. And you lose a significant amount of strength. Here's what's fascinating. They don't get this strength back for almost 12 weeks until they return to full strength, because that's how much it beats up their body, okay? But all this stuff, that's increased stride rate, decreased vertical oscillation, and the run economy, within, I think it was 2 weeks, a little less than 2 weeks, they were right back to running the way they normally run. That's the human body. That's amazing stuff, how quickly we adapt to things. So let's take running technique with a grain of salt. But let's move to strength training and rehabilitation, okay? This is a topic that is extremely gray area, okay? But when me, the outside person who I'm not talking to, I talk to PTs a lot, but what I often see in the literature and just talking to people is, all right, we need more trunk stability in runners. We need more glute rehab, you know, glute max, glute minimus. We need this stuff strengthened a lot more hip strengthening, because this is going to help runners, okay? This is going to make them better. And we see a ton of studies, okay? You know, you got McGill, and you have this one showing all the specific exercises for glute med and so on and so forth. But here's my question. How is this going to carry over into a 10,000 step run, okay? Doing, you know, hip abduction all day. Is this going to, you know, carry over into a marathon? We really don't know, okay? But we've seen success, right? We've seen that person come in, you do all this stuff for patellofemoral ITB, and they walk away feeling better, okay? Whether they're running at that point, are they doing any type of longer distance running that they did that got them to that point? We really don't know yet. Another guy I would highly suggest you look up if you're interested, really not in just running, but in terms of rehabilitation, but also pain science. This guy is a brain. He's not only a chiropractor, but he's also a physical therapist. He's been to both schools. And he basically says, hey, I did my PhD on core exercises, but I'm going back on what I said. I don't know how much of this stuff is actually going to carry over into distance runners, okay? But with that said, it's not going to hurt, okay? And I still make sure that all my runners do this stuff in the if their PT gives them this stuff, they do it in their warm-ups, they do it in their cool-downs, etc., okay? But when they do it, it's got to be frequent, and it's got to be often, okay? You have to do these things often, and here's why. So Irene Davis and Richard Wiley, they've done 3 pretty cool studies, all right? The first 2 studies were looked at, all right, if we did all this hip strengthening, is it going to affect running kinematics? Is it going to change anything, okay? No, it's not, okay? But here's the interesting thing. When you look at that study, they were doing 3 times a week, 3 sets of 12 of about 5 different exercises to strengthen the hip. That is garbage. That's virtually no strengthening at all. You need to do that every single day, and maybe we might see some benefit from it. That's my opinion, okay? But that's not a lot. 3 sets of 12 of 5 exercises, and you expect that to change something mechanically? Probably not. The last study they did was extremely fascinating. 2 weeks, okay, of GAIT retraining, 4 times a week for 2 hours, okay, with intermittent breaks. And the one group was doing this. The other group was basically, they were doing a little bit of GAIT retraining, just a very little bit, and they also were doing some hip strengthening. The group that did no HIPS training and just GAIT analysis, they were stronger all around in terms of their glutes, in terms of their core, so on and so forth, because of the things they were cueing to them, verbally, visually, etc. Okay? So that gives me some excitement in terms of, hey, GAIT analysis works. We might see some benefit from it, but it's exhausting, okay? You have to do a lot of it in order to see a little bit of return in runners who are not running that often. But here's my biggest problem with doing all these glutes and core exercises. Again, I say problem, I'm always going to implement them, all right? But it's really, who are you implementing them with, okay? So I was at a recent lecture with Michelle and Jeff, and the professor, he put this slide up, which I was really caught off guard. He threw Paula Radcliffe up there, who her glutes are, yes, not very defined. She may have no ass at all, like he said. And then he dovetailed that with, she needs to do more hip strengthening. She needs to do more core work, more hip abduction. He didn't say that specifically, but this is what he was packaged and selling. I hate how that's packaged and sold. I could give her hip abduction and all the clamshells in the world. She's not going to run 214 because she does more clamshells. That's just not how it's going to work. So be careful how it's sold and packaged. But guess what? I think for most of us, probably everyone in here, that stuff's going to work. It's going to help, all right? Because we will have some sort of fitness gain from that. This study was looking at delta efficiency. It's basically how we measure power in cyclists, okay? And they were looking at masters athletes compared to young athletes. And they found masters athletes that were doing basic leg extensions, okay? Their delta efficiency, or their basically cycling efficiency, what we would call running economy in the fitness world, increased fairly significantly. And even in the young guys and the young girls, you saw a little bit of increase in fitness. Not very much, but a little bit increase in fitness as well. So all this basic rehabilitative strength stuff, it's going to work. But there's going to be a time and place when that athlete gets to, running a certain amount of volume or a competitiveness, which is probably about 5%, if not less, of the people you guys see, that it might not have as much of an effect, okay? And training load plays a big part of that, both from a strength training standpoint and a cardiovascular standpoint. This is where we start to get a little out of my scope of practice, okay? You guys are much better at, hey, this is how you need to squat. This is how you need to do certain exercises. Because when we look at the progression of strength training, one, I want it to be dictated by you, okay? And two, there's certain types of strength training that we know is going to be fantastic for running economy, okay? So why not just work our athletes up, work our patients up to these types of exercises, okay? Not overnight, all right? So we know through the research, time and time again, that plyometrics and Olympic-type lifts, explosive strength training, is going to be the most beneficial from a running economy standpoint to improve that runner, okay? No, it does not mean CrossFit. It does not mean P90X and Insanity. I'm preaching to the choir here, okay? There's a great study by myself. Don't be an idiot, all right? Make sure you tell people not to do this stuff and realize to them, yes, or explain to them that, again, these things work. P90X, CrossFit, this stuff works. They will see their performance go up. So automatically they think it's good. You need to explain why it's not good from a technique standpoint and a progression standpoint. Maximal lifts, listen, you're probably not going to do this with any of your patients. I don't see it being a bad thing, doing it with no weight and body weight and really teaching them the movements. I think it's definitely beneficial for them, but most of the time, you want to work on plyometrics. There are a few studies out right now, and if you're interested in it, I can absolutely send them to you. But there are a few studies that not only show plyometrics benefit from a running economy standpoint, but also from an injury prevention standpoint. Not injury prevention, but a rehabilitative standpoint, where people are starting to incorporate plyometrics into their rehabilitative process. I've seen PTs do it for a long time, but it's really becoming a focal point now because it's as specific as we can get to the sport that we're doing, okay? We've got to progress it slowly, and we've seen some studies where you can do these plyometrics in the water. You guys have the perfect facility here for that, to do basic plyometrics, to get the technique down without the DOMs and the ground reaction forces associated with doing plyometrics and learning plyometrics. So this is one way to progress. Can also teach them some basic running drills, okay? This is stuff you can find on YouTube, high knees, butt kicks, fast feet. These are all mini plyometrics when you break them down. another way to progress your patients, okay? You can walk through these. You don't have to be explosive right away. I can just do high knees, teaching them what they're looking for, and then make that explosive pattern start to come into play. This is something I will do if an athlete asks me to take them through strength training. Your basic glute med, hip, core, trunk stability stuff, teaching them how to lift properly, and then slowly implementing in at the same time some plyometrics and some running drills, okay? You might get asked, all right, am I going to gain weight? Am I going to gain muscle? Because this is going to affect my running economy. Listen, unless they're eating 7,000 calories, if they're training for a marathon and trying to maintain muscles, hypertrophy, good luck, all right? They're going to have to eat a lot, okay? It is a very, very hard thing to do, okay? But it can be done. I trained an Ironman athlete. She was also a fitness competitor, and she literally was eating between 500 and 6,500 calories a day, okay? She hated it, but she wanted to keep her physique, okay? Yes, if you strength train prior to a run or 6 hours after a run, it's going to decrease your time to exhaustion. It may not necessarily affect your performance, though. It's definitely a gray area. I would suggest that when these athletes work out, your goal is not to create a major amount of fatigue, okay? The goal is just to slightly strengthen them and, again, continue to work on these explosive components, but ultimately you're not looking to fatigue them and affect their everyday runs, okay? A lot of other type of strength training out there. There's reactive strength, concurrent strength. These are just different ways to train somebody. Reactive strength is basically you see with a lot of sprinters. Boom, right off the start. It's another form of plyometric, but it's being packaged and sold as the next best thing in running. So is concurrent training, okay? Go out, do some intervals, then come in, do some plyometrics, do some strength training. This is just a different variation in training that's going to elicit a different stimulus, that's going to elicit a different response, okay? It's not better than anything else. It's not better than the fundamentals. Stick to the fundamentals. Bring them up towards plyometrics as quick as you can. You don't have to get nuts, all right? Explosive lifts, maybe. But you have to also look at the physiological consortium, or continuum. And basically what that means is there's many ways that I can stress an athlete. And I'll give you kind of a tidbit of what I do on a daily basis with ETA Coach. All right, these are two of my current athletes. This guy's 47 years old, Herb, and this guy over here, Pat, he's 24 years old. Okay, both of them came to me, very experienced runners. All right, they've been running a long time. Now, obviously, Herb, he's been running a lot. You know, he's 47 years old. He was Division I collegiate runner. Took about 10 years off in his, I think from like age 34 to early 40s, and then started getting back into masters running. But he has a very athletic running background, where Pat has ran all through middle school, all through high school, all through college, okay? And what I did, I went to, stress their physiology. And this is the key component that's going to help from a performance standpoint. Herb is your typical meathead, okay? He's going to go hard, fast, as much as he can. He's just going to do sprints, and he was training for the mile this season, okay, on the track. Last season, he went from 5:02 down to 4:52. It's not bad for a 47-year-old guy. I can't do that right now, okay? That's very impressive. So when I looked at all his training, all he was doing was this hard sprint stuff. I went to the other end of the spectrum, other end of the continuum of physiology, and I had him do long, steady state stuff, okay, at about 10K race pace. And that's what he did the most of. And we did some shorter, faster, harder stuff, but it was very infrequent, okay? And what did that result in? Doing workouts that really you would not think are for a mile. It resulted in he opened the season at 4:42, and he's now at 4:36, okay? And we're hoping that when he goes to national, he's going to run 4:32. So we're looking at almost a 30-second PR from the year before in the mile, okay? And all this is just taxing him a little different. There's no science. I mean, there's science behind it. There's no secrets, okay? This is just basic fundamental physiology. Pat, I did the complete opposite. He's one of these knuckleheads that likes to go out and run 50-mile races. He was ranked top 15 in the country in his age group for running like just under a 7-minute pace for 50 miles. Again, I don't know why in the world he's doing these things. But with that said, he's like, oh, I hit a plateau. I'm like, you're 24. You didn't hit a plateau. You're nowhere near your plateau. All right? So he hasn't done any type of sprint work in forever. So that's all I had him do is sprint work. And he's PR'd in every single race in the past 4 months. This is basic physiology. This is where the athlete's going to improve the most, okay? But this is also where they're going to get hurt the most, okay? Because they want to do it fast. They want to overload. They want more volume, more intensity, etc. And what we do know is this, is that your cardiovascular, your metabolic systems, adapts very quickly to training, okay? Where your soft tissues, your bones, your muscles, your ligaments, your musculoskeletal system does not adapt as quickly. Everyone right now, I don't care if you don't run a step, I know for a fact could go run 10 miles, okay? I know it. Cardiovascularly, I know you could do it. Metabolically, I know you could do it. Musculoskeletally, a lot different, okay? We don't know if you'd be able to hold up during that, okay? And that's what we have to have athletes understand. We gotta make sure they're patient and they progress slower, okay? You gotta have them walk more, all right? You do and you have to have them do it frequently, all right? My nephews came to me, 5, 10 years ago, I don't even know when it was, they're old now, and they were doing long division. They said, I'm really not a huge math guy, but I remember how to do long division. And their teacher was giving them homework twice a week in long division, and they weren't doing very well. They were sitting there on Tuesday and Thursday for 45 minutes doing this math. So this is ridiculous. I actually contacted the teacher and I said, look, give them homework 7 days a week, just for these two because they're struggling. 15 minutes a day, that's all they did, 7 days a week. What do you think better? What happened to them? Frequency, they learned the math much quicker. They weren't overloaded on 2 different days. They spread it out, okay? They cognitively picked it up a lot quicker. Your physiology, your musculoskeletal system does not work any differently, okay? This is how I progress people back from running. That is extremely slow. They are gonna hate you. If you mention walking, if you mention this type of progression program, they're probably gonna find another physical therapist. I'm just letting you know ahead of time. You need to convince them this is what's going to help them, okay? Now, this is drastic. This was done for an individual who had been to every PT, every chiropractor, orthotics, thought about surgery, this, that, and the other thing. She was having constant patellofemoral and ITB issues, okay? Told her to go to PT, extensive PT. We were doing these exercises very frequently, 5 times a day, sets of 20 or 30 until exhaustion, and we started implementing at the same time this type of progression. A year and a half later, she was only running about 15 miles a week, but she was running faster than she was in high school, which was nothing to spit at. I mean, she was running like 20 flat 5K for a 42-year-old woman, okay? And she wasn't injured. And now she's running about 40 miles a week, doing half marathons, training for a marathon. That's it. All she did was progress very, very slowly. You can also do a lot of deep water running like this as well. Be careful with this. It can definitely overload hip flexors and so on and so forth. So you have to do that pretty slow as well. But whether they are elite or newbie, I have my athletes walk. If they want to implement another day of running, they know they're going to walk first, okay? Recent study, just like 2 weeks ago, was released. They had one group run a marathon in a walk-run pattern and one group not. And they actually were looking at cardiovascular stress. And interesting enough, the cardiovascular stress was exactly the same versus the group who did walk-run. They ran a mile and walked 2 minutes for the entire race versus just ran the race. They all finished around 4 hours, okay? And ultimately, the biggest thing that they found out of this, which was interest to me, makes total sense, is they were a lot less beat up, the walk-run group, okay? They were recovered and ready to run 2 or 3 days later versus the group that ran the whole thing, and basically a little bit faster, maybe 5, 10 minutes faster. They were pretty beat up and they weren't able to run for about a week and a half after all that, muscle soreness and DOMS had left, okay? So implementing this walking is gonna help. I'll leave you with this in terms of walking. I'm fascinated with Japanese runners. It's the weirdest thing. I hate saying that sometimes, but it's really interesting to look at these guys because their national team, half the time of the year, except in really like cycles where they're specifically focused on a race, they are not only instructed or running between 80 and 110 miles, they're walking 80 to 110 miles as well a week. So in addition, doing 200 plus miles. That's insanity. I don't want you leaving here and going to your patient, by the way, I want you to walk 80 miles this week. No, that's not what I'm looking for, okay? But I love where their head's at here, okay? Because they're thinking, all right, East Africans, where a lot of these concepts are coming from, they're walking back and forth to work, to school every day, they're in the fields, okay? More time on the feet is making them a little bit more durable. We need to see research on it to see if it really does carry over from an injury preventive, progressive performance standpoint, but it's an interesting fact. Have them run a little faster, okay? Jeff, got some studies to support your spreadsheet there. So you can actually, you don't have to have them go out and run very slow, okay? You can actually have them run faster because this is going to bring them on their midfoot, their forefoot. They're going to be off the ground a lot quicker, okay? So ground reaction forces will be a lot less. Maybe someone has more of a gastrosoleus, strain. You might actually want to have them run a lot slower, and that's what some of these studies have recently looked at. Gray area, something to think about. Another tool in the toolbox just like hill running, you know, a lot less ground reaction force. When someone is having all these issues and they really want to get back to run them, have them start walking up and down hills and then doing hill repeats. This doesn't mean go to the hill and absolutely sprint it as hard as you can until you can throw up, because that's what most people do when they see a hill. They, you know, it's kind of an ego thing. I'm going to run up this as fast as I can. No, have them do a little hill running. It's going to take a lot of that load off their knees and hips, okay? If you're looking for a good program, kind of a template to go off of, I'd highly suggest, and you can just email me, but the Ohio State University Medical Center, they put together a very, very good progressive program for not only training load, which we just talked about, but also plyometrics and strength training as well. I really was impressed by it. The only thing I would say is I would change is their progression of walking and running. I probably, in many cases, you're going to change. You might get more aggressive, or you might actually be not as aggressive as they have it. But this is the way I think we're seeing more rehabilitative programs go with running, all right? Leading them right away to plyometrics, okay? And then progressing from there. These are all the things we touched on. The only two things we did not touch on are footwear and running surfaces. You got to be careful with these, but what we do know for the literature and footwear is that, yes, you can vary your footwear and then ultimately will place the load in different spots and may be an injury preventative thing. You want to be careful with that in injured athletes. And also, there's no footwear, you know, I know Dave Welsh owns all the local stores in the area. I've worked in footwear for 10 years. There's a lot of different shoes that say, hey, if you put a little dual density midsole in that medial aspect of the shoe, it's going to keep you from overpronating and that's going to help you. There's no validity to that. And there's studies to prove that that doesn't work. But listen, this is where that kind of personal inference, you know, comes into play. I can't tell you, you know, I've been working in the running community for 15 years, and I have a guy who comes in who's 250 pounds, and he wants to do a marathon, and I put him in a shoe that says it's going to help him, you know, pronate less. He puts him in it, and he's having shin splints, and he comes back 2 weeks later, these shoes are the best thing ever. Placebo effect? Probably, you know, but I think there's something to be said for that. It might work, but vary your shoes. As far as the running surfaces, it never hurts to go on softer surfaces. I leave you with this. This is often what's sold and packaged to runners nowadays, okay? You know, oh, you have bad posture. You know, your core is terrible, okay? And it's the way, that's fine if they have bad posture. It's fine if they have a bad core, you know, but whatever is being sold in terms of what's going to improve that, we gotta be careful how we sell it in the sense of it's going to improve your running economy, or you're not going to get injured anymore, because it's a gray area and we don't have a lot of research on it to prove it. God forbid someone had a little bit of knee valgus. Oh my God, they're going to be hurt. This is just human variation. Everyone's different. Everyone's going to have some sort of biomechanical variation like this. Doesn't mean we have to completely correct it. It means we may need to progress that training load a little bit slower for certain people and faster for others. You're not training these guys, the fastest runners in the world. You're training these guys, okay? So all that stuff that I was just kind of negging in the sense of, you know, posture and core and so on, do it, strengthen it. It's only going to help them. But once they start getting to this level, it's a lot different. That's it, guys. Be more than happy to answer any questions.